Our high school guidance counselor used to ask us what you would do if you had $1 million. Didn't have to work. And then invariably, whatever you'd say, that was supposed to be your career. So if you wanted to fix old cars, then you're supposed to be an auto mechanic.
So what did you say?
I never had an answer. I guess that's why I'm working in Initech.
No, you're working at Initech because that question is bullshit to begin with. If everyone listened to her, there'd be no janitors because no one would clean shit up if they had $1 million.
You know what I would do if I had $1 million? I would invest half of it in low-risk mutual funds and then take the other half over to my friend Asadullah, who works in securities.
Samir, you're missing the point. The point of the exercise is that you're supposed to figure out what you would want to do. If PC load letter, what the fuck does that mean?
Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
War hero Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm not an idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
All right. Originally, I planned this week to be an interview with Shama Sawant, but we had some scheduling changes, and it's going to be pushed back a little bit. So just stay tuned for that. I'm also planning on doing some more interviews in the coming weeks on a variety of different topics. So it's kind of an exciting time here at the Sensible Socialist Podcast. So as I've been wanting to do, here's just some of the quick highlights, I think, of this past week's news. Hurricane Michael hit Florida and caused quite a bit of damage. In Georgia, the governor, the guy who is running for governor, is also the guy who controls the votes and is actively engaged in a voter suppression attempt. And so the Kanye West phenomenon at the White House happened, and if you haven't seen, obviously, I'm sure everyone's seen what happened there. I have almost nothing to say about it. It was a very confusing and frustrating experience to have to see that interaction and whatever you'd want to call it. I'm not sure what's going on with Kanye West, and I definitely know that Donald Trump is just playing everyone on this, or everyone who would ever be swayed by anything Kanye West says, and is using it as a way of saying that he's cool with black people, and I don't think that that's accurate. So Michael Cohen became a Democrat. That's an interesting thing. He's a former Trump lawyer who was supposedly going to be with him to the end of days, is now not even in the party, I guess. I don't know. It seems like a bit of showboating, but we'll see. There was a climate change report that came out this week and was pretty devastating news. The CPCC report kind of gave us a window where after essentially 2040, things have 30 years or so before things get seriously bad. And there was talk of, climate genocide because it is going to displace or destroy tons of people. And I think that that's an interesting conversation that somebody could have, or maybe I'll write about. I did see a poll that came out that, at least in the Senate, Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician in the Senate, and Mitch McConnell is the least. And I think that I also saw an article that several members of the Democratic Party and people on the inside and in the know do think that if Bernie Sanders runs in 2020, which he probably will, he will likely be the Democratic candidate. So that'll be an interesting development to see how that goes. The death penalty in Washington was overturned. which is an interesting development. The number's been dwindling, obviously, for death penalty places, but there's holdout states, and it's weird that Washington was actually one of those holdout states, but I commend the decision, though interestingly it's based on the fact that there's racial bias in who is being put to death, and not necessarily that it is cruel and unusual or something like that, which I think is a very interesting angle to get a good result. So, last thing, I'm into space things, and this week, a Soyuz rocket taking a crew up to the International Space Station had a failure on one of the initial booster, and had to do a ballistic trajectory back down. Didn't get into orbit, and it's the first time that's happened, that they've had a failure like that on a Soyuz rocket since 1975. So that's pretty interesting. They're obviously doing an investigation as much as they can to figure out what's going to happen, but it's obviously going to disrupt the schedule for the International Space Station and bring into question the continued use of the rocket, the R-7, which is essentially the same rocket that launched Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin and all of some of the most important parts of Soviet and Russian space flight. So that'll be interesting.
So, where do you work, Peter?
In a tech.
And what do you do there?
I sit in a cubicle, and I update bank software for the 2000 switch. Well, see, they wrote all this bank software, and to save space, they used 2 digits for the date instead of 4, so like 98 instead of 1998. So I go through these thousands of lines of code, and it doesn't really matter. I don't like my job, and I don't think I'm gonna go anymore.
You're just not gonna go?
Yeah,
Won't you get fired?
I don't know. But I really don't like it, and I'm not gonna go.
So you're gonna quit?
Nuh-uh, not really. I'm just gonna stop going.
When did you decide all of that?
About an hour ago.
Really?
Yeah.
An hour. So you gonna get another job?
I don't think I'd like another job.
What are you gonna do about money and bills and...
You know, I've never really liked paying bills. I don't think I'm gonna do that either.
Well, so what do you want to do?
I want to take you out to dinner. And then I want to go back to my apartment and watch Kung Fu. Do you ever watch Kung Fu?
I love Kung Fu.
Channel 39.
Totally.
You should come over and watch Kung Fu tonight.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. Can we order lunch first?
Yeah.
All right, so on to the main subject of this week's episode, which is alienation. So alienation is, I think, something that we really need to talk about and aren't talking about enough. I recently read an article that was titled, "Why do all my friends want to kill themselves?" And the CDC report, the CDC has come out with a report just showing these incredible rates of suicide and depression. We've got an opioid epidemic. We've got all of these pretty terrible things going on in our society, and there's always this idea that the cause is social media or the internet generally, or just like this quote unquote snowflake mentality, or whatever, a number of different kind of sources, but rarely do they ever really get down to what is at the core of this and what's really actually going on, which is, I think, alienation. It's a term that's out of favor with everybody right now because it's obviously pretty Marxy, even though it has way deeper roots, and it seems to like not really be a useful thing to modern scholars. But I think that when you look through it, you can really see Marx's kind of genius, and the way he combined it with his unique perceptive and philosophical ability, like it gives a great way to understand what's going on, and how part of the thing that we need to understand is that this isn't an individual problem. The way that we fix it isn't by giving more people drugs or anything like that. It's about changing our relationship to our society, each other, and what we do. And so we'll get into that. I mean, the idea of alienation isn't unique to Marx. The notions can trace back very, very far away. I think human beings in some ways have this as a particular problem. We are perceptive enough and intelligent enough to understand that we aren't a lot of other things. And there's this notion that we are something, but we are also something disconnected. You can look back at Judeo-Christian ideas, the notion of a disconnection from God. You have the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. To alienate has, ironically or not, a unique legalistic definition in property law, the ability to give property freely to another, which is an important fundamental principle in liberal notions of liberty and freedom. For Hegel, who Marx owes a great deal, the sort of unhappy consciousness is divided against itself and separated from its essence, which is put in this place beyond. That happens in a lot of religious ideas. It comes out in even a mind-body dualism, the idea that we are our body and also our mind, or maybe our soul. This notion of alienation being sort of separated from what we actually are or what we actually should be is not unique to Marx, and it's something that really pervades all kinds of different philosophy. So, as used before, philosophers like Hegel and Marx, the reflective German verbs, it's einhausern, to divest oneself of, or einfrieden, so to become estranged, to, that's, my German's terrible, so don't laugh at me, but you can if you want. But those mean that the term alienation, it's self-alienation. It's the idea that I am something and it's estranged from my own essential nature. It's not that I am alienated from other people. I'm not alone. I'm alienated from myself. So it's a lack of self-worth. It's the absence of meaning. It's a life that doesn't have any purpose or self-fulfillment. It's just a life not worth living. There's no way to be actualized or to be prosperous or to flourish, to become who you really are, or to become your true self. And obviously this is a big issue for a lot of people. This is, I think, why partly Jordan Peterson has become very popular, because he's tapping into a serious feeling of not feeling like we have the ability to become who we are, and wanting to have someone who can tell us how we can be. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel has this very complicated and dialectical method of how the self becomes aware of itself and understands and explains that through this process of alienation and a dialectical synthesis between subject-object relations, and it's very sort of complicated and interesting. If you want to check it out, I would check out the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. If you can understand what the preface is talking about, then you're well on your way. But when you talk about Marx's theory of alienation, the best example of this is in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, which didn't come out until 1932. So this whole idea that Marx talked about in terms of the alienation was not even, part of the way that people were talking about it, at least Marx's theory, before 1932. This is well after the Russian Revolution. I mean, this is in the early, just before the World War II. So it's important to understand that these ideas were in Marx's mind and he had written down, and these are part of his way of looking at the world, but nobody really knew it in terms of understanding what his real perspective was. And I think that that's important to take away from it. But he talks about being alienated as still a self-estrangement, feeling disconnected and not what you really could be. I think he takes Hegel's point on that. But he is looking at it more materialistically, and he takes some cues from The Essence of Christianity by Ludwig Feuerbach, and he states that the idea, Feuerbach states that the idea of a supernatural God has alienated the natural characteristics of a human being, that we have basically made God we're not made in the image of God, but God is made in our image, and he is everything that we are not. He is the alienated human essence in single person form. And the Marx sort of used this idea that there is this self-estrangement, because in the way of understanding that we have a species essence. Human beings are a certain kind of thing. We are an animal that is able to produce and do things, and that productive ability in human beings is guided by our language skills and the social skills of our evolutionary heritage, but that we really are obviously beings of production. Look at all the things that we can and want to make. If we are bored, we tend to make stuff, that we are productive animals. And so being alienated from that's our species essence. And the idea of being estranged from it, being alienated from it, is there being something that prevents us from being the fullest expression of our productive nature. So, in capitalist society, workers' alienation from that species essence, from the ability to really be self-fulfilling and produce what you want to, where you want to, in the way that you want to, or at least have an ability to participate in how we do that, and not being controlled or being part of the cogs, is because the only way that a worker can express labor, that fundamental social aspect of personal individuality, is through this private system of industrial production, in which each worker is like an atomized instrument and a thing, not a person. So in a Kantian sort of way, in capitalist production, human beings are means to an ends and not ends in themselves. So Marx says in the comment on James Mill, that's 1844, around the same time he's writing the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, that says, let's suppose that we had carried out production as human beings. Each of us would have in two ways affirmed himself and other people. In my production, I would have objectified my individuality in its specific character, and therefore enjoyed not only an individual manifestation of my life during the activity, but also when looking at the object, I'd have the individual pleasure of knowing my personality to be objective, visible to the senses, and hence a power beyond all doubt. In your enjoyment or use of my product, I would have the direct enjoyment both of being conscious of having satisfied a human need by my work, that is, having objectified my essential nature, and having thus created an object corresponding to the need of another man's essential nature. Our products would be in so many mirrors in which we saw reflected our essential nature. Now, that's just beautifully written, but B, you see exactly what he's talking about. And I don't think it takes much for any of us to realize that when we go to work, we don't exactly feel like we're creating expressions of our essential nature, that we are very disconnected from the idea that this is what we really want to do, and this is what we're all about, and this is who we are. And the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, Marx identified 4 types of alienation that occur to the workers in a capitalist system of industrial production. And I'll be honest with you, there's going to be some longer quotes from it because A, I think it's absolutely beautifully written, and B, it gets exactly to the point, and you don't have to read it if you don't want to. So you can skip past this. I'll let you know when the quote's ended. But so here's what he says in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. Just a quick note, this was written in 1844, and Marx is going to use the convention of using man as a standard for human and he instead of any other. He's using masculine pronouns. So just giving you a warning, that's what it's going to be like. I'm reading it directly from the way he wrote it. All right, so We're going to proceed from an actual economic fact. The worker becomes all the more poorer the more wealth he produces. The more his production increases in power and size. The worker becomes an even cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. The devaluation of the world of men is in direct proportion to the increasing value of the world of things. Labor produces not only commodities, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity, and this at the same rate at which it produces commodities in general. This fact expresses merely that the object which labor produces, labor's product, confronts it as something alien, as a power independent of the producer. The product of labor is labor which has been embodied in an object, which has become material. It is the objectification of labor. Labor's realization is its objectification. Under these economic conditions, this realization of labor appears as a loss of realization for the workers, objectification as loss of the object and bondage to it, appropriation as estrangement, as alienation. So much does the labor's realization appear as a loss of realization that the worker loses realization to the point of starving to death. So much does objectification appear as a loss of the object that the worker is robbed of the objects most necessary not only for his life, but for his work. Indeed, labor itself becomes an object which he can obtain only with the greatest effort and with the most irregular interruptions. So much does the appropriation of the object appear as estrangement, that the more objects the worker produces, the less he can possess, and the more he falls away under the sway of his product, capital. All these consequences are implied in the statement that the worker is related to the product of labor as to an alien object. For on this premise, it's clear that the more the worker spends on himself, the more powerful becomes the alien world of objects which he creates over and against himself. The poorer he himself, his inner world, becomes, the less belongs to him as his own. It's the same in religion. The more man puts into God, the less he retains in himself. The worker puts his life into the object, but now his life no longer belongs to him, but to the object. Hence, the greater this activity, the more the worker lacks objects. Whatever the product of his labor is, he is not. Therefore, the greater this product, the less he is of himself. The alienation of the worker in his product means not only that his labor becomes an object, an external existence, but that it exists outside him, independently as something alien to him, and that it becomes a power on its own confronting him. It means that the life which he has conferred on the object confronts him as something hostile and alien. Let's now look more closely at the objectification, at the production of the worker, and in it at the estrangement, the loss of the object of his product. The worker can create nothing without nature, without the sensus external world. It's the material world on which labor is realized, and in which it's active, from which and by the means of which it produces. But just as nature provides labor with the means of life in the sense that labor cannot live without the objects on which to operate, on the other hand, it also provides the means of life in the more restricted sense, the means for the physical subsistence of the worker himself. Thus, the more the worker by his labor appropriates the external world, the sensus nature, the more he deprives himself of the means of life in two respects. First, in that the sensus world more and more ceases to be an object belonging to his labor, to be his labor's means of life. And second, that it more and more ceases to be the means of life in the immediate sense, the means for the physical subsistence of the worker. You're not actually planting the plants that you're taking out of the ground and eating. In both respects, therefore, the worker becomes a servant of his object, first, in that he receives an object of labor, in that he receives work, and secondly, in that he receives the means of subsistence. This enables him to exist, first as a worker, and second as a physical subject. The height of this servitude is that only as a worker he can maintain himself as a physical subject, and that it's only as a physical subject that he's a worker. A human being has become an object, and a self-understanding object. According to the economic laws of estrangement, the worker in his object is expressed thus. The more the worker produces, the less he has to consume. The more value he creates, the more valueless, the more unworthy he becomes. The better formed his product, the more deformed becomes the worker. In more civilized his object, the more barbarous becomes the worker. The more powerful labor becomes, the more powerless becomes the worker. The more ingenious labor becomes, the less ingenious becomes the worker, and the more he becomes nature's slave. If that doesn't describe what's happening with technology and social media, I'm not sure what does. Political economy conceals the estrangement inherent in the nature of labor by not considering the direct relationship between the worker and production. It's true that the labor produces for the rich wonderful things, but for the worker it produces privation. It produces palaces, but for the worker, hovels. It produces beauty, but for the worker, deformity. It replaces labor by machines, but it throws one section of the workers back into barbarous types of labor, and it turns the other section into a machine. It produces intelligence, but for the worker, stupidity and cretinism. The direct relationship of labor to its products is the relationship of the worker to the objects of his production. The relationship of the man of means to the objects of production and to production itself is only a consequence of the first relationship, and it confirms it. We shall consider this another aspect later. But when we ask then, what's the essential relationship of labor when we are asking about the relationship of the worker to production? So what Marx is talking about there is how the things that we actually create are things alien to us, that we make all of these amazing things and produce all of these incredible things that happen, but we feel unfulfilled. They are not ours. We don't feel any ownership over them because they were not done by our intentional and desiring labor, but because we realize that we're a worker first and a human being second. The design of the product, how it's produced, they're all determined not by the people who are actually producing them, by the workers, and not even by the consumers. The buyers aren't determining how things are done. It's the capitalist class, who, besides accommodating the worker's manual labor, also accommodates the intellectual labor of the engineer, the industrial designer, the software designer, whatever, and whoever created the object in order to shape the taste of the consumer to buy the goods and services at the price that yields the maximum profit. I don't think that I need to make much of a claim about the, let's say, shallowness of the brand kind of loyalties and different things like that that are in some ways, I think, an expression of our alienation from our products. Many of us are obviously not producing any of the things that we want to enjoy, from our cell phones and to even our cars. And I think the understanding that we are just so disconnected makes us less human, less able to express who it is that we really are and what we can achieve if we aren't constantly distracted, constantly hounded and shaped by the people who want to sell us the things that they are hiring us to produce and making money off our backs. I think that we all kind of deep down inside know that this is happening, and we want to find ways to escape it. And I think that's a pretty obvious expression of the idea of alienation.
Oh, hi, Bob. Bob, why don't you go ahead and grab a seat and join us for a minute or two? You see, what we're actually trying to do here is we're trying to get a feel for how people spend their day at work. So, if you would you walk us through a typical day for you?
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I generally come in at least 15 minutes late. I use the side door. That way Lumberg can't see me. And after that, I just sort of space out for about an hour.
Space out?
Yeah, I just stare at my desk. But it looks like I'm working. I do that for probably another hour after lunch, too. I'd say in a given week, I probably only do about 15 minutes of real, actual work.
Peter, would you be a good sport and indulge us and just tell us a little more?
Oh, yeah. Let me tell you something about TPS reports. The thing is, Bob, it's not that I'm lazy. It's that I just don't care.
Don't care?
It's a problem of motivation, all right? Now, if I work my ass off and Initech ships a few extra units, I don't see another dime. So where's the motivation? And here's something else, Bob. I have 8 different bosses right now.
I beg your pardon?
8 bosses.
8?
8, Bob. So that means that when I make a mistake, I have 8 different people coming by to tell me about it. That's my only real motivation, is not to be hassled. That and the fear of losing my job. But you know, Bob, that'll only make someone work just hard enough not to get fired.
Would you bear with me for just a second, please?
Okay.
What if, and believe me, this is so hypothetical, but what if you were offered some kind of a stock option equity sharing program? Would that do anything for you?
I don't know, I guess. Listen, I'm gonna go. It's been really nice talking to both of you guys.
Absolutely. The pleasure's all on this side of the table, trust me.
Good luck with your layoffs, all right? I hope your firings go really well.
Excellent. Great. Wow.
I don't think there's a better movie to talk about alienation than Office Space, but let's get back to it. There's alienation of the worker from the act of production. So this is Marx again. First, the fact that labor is external to the worker, that it doesn't belong to him in his intrinsic nature, that in his work, therefore, he doesn't affirm himself, but he denies himself. He doesn't feel content, but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker, therefore, only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. Feels at home when he's not working, and when he's working, he doesn't feel at home. His labor is therefore not voluntary, but it's coerced. It's forced labor. It's therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It's merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. External labor, labor in which man alienates himself, is a labor of self-sacrifice, of mortification. Lastly, the external character of labor for the worker appears in the fact that this is not his own, but someone else's, that it doesn't belong to him, that it is he that belongs, not to himself, but to another. Just as in religion, the spontaneous activity of the human imagination, of the human brain and the human heart, operates on the individual independently of him, that is, operates as an alien, divine, or diabolical activity. So is the worker's activity not his spontaneous activity, it belongs to another, and it's the loss of himself. As a result, therefore, man, the worker, only feels himself freely active in his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating, or, at most, in his dwelling and in dressing up. But in his human function, his production, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is an animal become human, and what is human becomes animal. Certainly eating, drinking, procreating, etc. are also genuinely human functions, but taken abstractly, separated from the spheres of all other human activity, and turned into sole and ultimate ends. They are animal functions. We've considered the act of estrangement practical human activity, labor, in 2 of its aspects: the relation of the worker to the product of labor, as an alien object exercising power over him. This relationship is at the same time the relationship to the senses external world, to the objects of nature, as an alien world inimically opposed to him. The relation of labor to the act of production within the labor process. That's the second type. This relation is the relationship to the worker to his own activity, as an alien activity not belonging to him. It is activity as suffering, strength as weakness, beginning as emasculating. The worker's own physical and mental energy, his personal life. For what is life but activity? As an activity which is turned against him, independent of him, and not belonging to him. Here we have self-estrangement, as previously we had estrangement of a thing. I think this is pretty obvious. This is a way that very, very, very many of us feel, especially those who are working in retail positions or even call centers or a place that they're doing essentially customer service or something like that. These are jobs that are not what we want to do. They're what we have to do to make sure that we get the money to keep living. But we are actually not what we want to be, not expressing our nature of just wanting to do stuff because we want to do those things, but that we're doing it because we belong to someone else. It's a fairly terrible feeling for a lot of people, and we don't often talk about it because it sucks to talk about. But we all kind of understand that we're living in little dictatorships when we go to work. And nobody likes to live in a dictatorship. But I guess we kind of feel like there's not a whole lot that we can do about it. And so we just do it. It's pretty terrible. And it's totally understandable why we are looking for what Marx says, the animal desires, eating, drinking, procreating. I mean, it's Tinder in the bars. It's understandable why we're doing this kind of thing, because our work is alienating ourselves in the things that we even produce and in the activity itself. But there's more other kinds of alienation for a worker in capitalism. The alienation of the worker from their species and essence. Their Guswesen, I guess. Sorry, again, German's terrible. But what Marx says is man is a species being. He uses this species-being. Not only because in practice and in theory he adopts the species, his own as well as those of others, as his object, but, and this is only another way of expressing it, also because he treats himself as the actual living species, because he treats himself as a universal and therefore a free being. The life of the species, both in man and animals, consists physically in the fact that man, like the animal, lives on organic nature. And the more universal man, or the animal, is, the more universal is the sphere of inorganic nature on which he lives, just as plants, animals, stones, air, light, etc., constitute theoretically a part of human consciousness, partly as objects of natural science, partly as objects of art. His spiritual inorganic nature, spiritual nourishment which he must first prepare to make palatable and digestible, so also in the realm of practice they constitute a part of human life and human activity. Physically, man lives only on these products of nature, whether they appear in the form of food, heating, clothing, a dwelling. The universality of man appears in practice precisely in the universality which makes all nature in his inorganic body, both inasmuch as nature is one, his direct means of life, and two, the material, the object, and the instrument of his life activity. Nature is man's inorganic body. Nature, that is, insofar it is not itself human body. Man lives on nature, means that nature is his body, with which he must remain in continuous interchange, if he is not to die. That man's physical and spiritual life is linked to nature, means simply that nature is linked to itself, for man's a part of nature. So in estranging man, one, nature, and two, himself, his own active functions, his life activity, estranged labor estranges the species from man. It changes for him the life of the species into a means of individual life. First, it estranges the life of the species and individual life, and secondly, it makes individual life in its abstract form the purpose for the life of the species, likewise in its abstract and estranged form. This is the idea that the individual is all that matters. You hearing me, Dave Rubin? For labor, life activity, productive life itself, appears to man in the first place merely as a means of satisfying a need, the need to maintain physical existence. Yet, the productive life is the life of the species. It is the life engendering life. The whole character of a species, its species character, is contained in the character of its life activity, and free, conscious activity is man's species character. Life itself appears only as a means to life. The animal is immediately one with its life activity. It does not distinguish itself from it. It is its life activity. Man makes his life activity itself in the object of his will and his consciousness. He has conscious life activity. It is not a determination of which he directly emerges. Conscious life actively distinguishes man immediately from animal life activity. It is just because of this that he is a species being, or it is only because he is a species being that he is a conscious being, that his own life is an object for him. Only because of that, his activity is free activity. Estranged labor reverses this relationship, so that it is just because man is conscious being that he makes his life activity, his essential being, a mere means to his existence. It's a weird kind of way to say it, but essentially it's talking about what it is to really be a human being, and what it is to be a human being is to be a free and to engage in free and conscious activity. And we are not able to be in free conscious activity when our essential being becomes that ability to engage in conscious activity becomes the mere means to existence. It isn't the expression of who we are. It is a statement of the destruction of who we are. One of the other things that Marx talks about, and I think is an important aspect, is our alienation from not only our estranged labor position, but that the role that estranged labor position plays for individuals and obviously for the species, but also just for each other. And I think one of the insights that he has is that we're all experiencing the self-estrangement of labor, and so the interactions between us have been thoroughly commodified and become objects as well. So much of our interaction with our co-workers is essentially based in a wage. We're all getting a wage, but we all also know that we are getting different wages. And what Marx says is that where the product as the object of labor pays for labor, there the wage is but a necessary consequence of labor's estrangement. Likewise, in the wage of labor, labor doesn't appear as an end in itself, but as the servant of the wage. And I think this is an important thing when you hear the critiques of Marxism being, that you just want everyone to get paid the same. This is what Marx says about that in the Manuscripts. An enforced increase of wages, disregarding all other difficulties, including the fact that it would be only by force to do it, and that such an increase being an anomaly would have to be maintained only by that violence, would therefore be nothing but a better payment for the slave, and would not win either for the worker or for labor their human status and dignity. Indeed, even the equality of wages as demanded by Proudhon only transforms the relationship of the present-day worker to his labor into the relationship of all men to labor. Society would then be conceived as an abstract capitalist. Wages are a direct consequence of estranged labor, and estranged labor is the direct cause of private property. The downfall of one must therefore involve the downfall of the other. From the relationship of estranged labor to private property, it follows further that the emancipation of society from private property, from servitude, is expressed in the political form of the emancipation of the workers. Not that their emancipation alone is at stake, but because the emancipation of the workers contains universal human emancipation. And it contains this because the whole of human servitude is involved in the relation of worker to production. And all relations of servitude are but modifications and consequences of this relation. Just as we have derived the concept of private property from the concept of estranged, alienated labor by analysis, so we can develop every category of the political economy with the help of these two factors. And we shall find again in each category, trade, competition, capital, money, only a particular and developed expression of these first elements. I think that's a very important thing to understand. That we're not talking about artificial increases in wages as an expression of communism, because this is a deeper thing. It's about getting us away from this position that we all feel completely disconnected from our jobs, And even if we don't, we feel incredibly lucky because we know how many aren't. It's a situation where we all know the vast amount of people who are working at places that they hate or don't want to do or just doing it for the money. And that is something that brings us all down and also just makes the relationship between us highly commodified and very transactional. And we can see an increase in the number of people suing each other because they have that kind of relationship. Families even doing this kind of thing. It is broken down every other formerly existing social maintenance tool that has ever been invented, because capitalism maintains itself and is able to do what it's wanting to do because it estranges the labor of individuals. And that labor of being productive, free, conscious activity is who we really are. It's what our essential human nature, for lack of a better term, is. It is what distinguishes us from other animals. And it's being disallowed from being the expression of our self-worth, our relational worth, our relation to the things that we produce in it. It destroys all of those things and makes us disconnected from everything. So alienation is a very real phenomenon. We are seeing it in the expressions nowadays, especially as we get into the late stage capitalist period where you have a economic collapse and nothing's really done, and we're quote unquote in the recovery period, just waiting for the collapse to happen. That's what's going. That the expressions of these alienation is everywhere. We are so transactional with everything in the Tinder and social media kind of social relations, in highly commoditizing every single thing, in the gig economy, in the precariousness of work, all of these kinds of things. We all know it, and we feel powerless to do anything about it because it feels so alien to us. We are all feeling alienated from each other, from our lives, and from who we really are. That doesn't bode well for a society, and that directly relates to why we have serious issues of mental health crises, of addiction and drug epidemics, and all of those kinds of things. Everyone is looking for an escape from a system that they fundamentally know is not congruent with who they are. And that's not great. But the cool thing is that we have analyses of this system and know what we can do about it. And what we can do about it is fix it, is to find a way to cut through this objectified and alienated, estranged labor of ours and get together in order to enact the system that would allow our free conscious activity to be the daily expression of who we really are. If we created a system that were able to do that, that would be a system that we would all have better relations, have stronger relations, have a better society, and genuinely enjoy the objects that we together and cooperatively create. So we're not talking about what normally people talk about when we're talking about communism and its way of looking at labor. We're talking about it in a deep philosophical sense, and we're able to cut through and say it's not about drugs. We don't need more psychotropic drugs to deal with depression. We don't need stricter drug laws to deal with an opioid epidemic. We don't need therapists to tell us that it's all our individual fault. We don't need the Jordan Petersons of the world to do that. What we need is to have our therapists talk about politics, to be able to discuss with our coworkers how much we are making, to see how much our labor is really objectified and how different our wages are, so that we can understand how our coworkers are really doing, and hopefully make those kind of connections that will get us to move beyond estranged labor. It's important to be able to examine the system, not looking at it through rose-colored glasses. Now, it's not looking at it only through negative glasses either. There are some useful things that this system has destroyed, and it has created the ability for us to truly express our free and conscious activity. And as technology grows and our industrial and technological capacity continues to exponentially grow, the ability for us to be able to take advantage of this so that we can truly express who we are is only that much more possible. So now is the time to begin realizing just how alienated we are and why we're alienated. And the reason is because of the existence of private property and its protections, that being the system of capitalism. You want to fix these mental health crises, you want to do these, you want to make sure that we can get along better and have stronger relations with each other, start by looking at the system. It's the root cause.
Lawrence, what would you do if you had $1 million?
I'll tell you what I'd do, man. 2 chicks at the same time, man.
That's it? You had $1 million, you'd do 2 chicks at the same time?
Damn straight. Always wanted to do that, man. And I think if I were a millionaire, I could hook that up, too, because chicks dig dudes with money.
Well, not all chicks.
Well, that chicks that double up on a dude like me do.
Good point.
Well, what about you now? What would you do?
Besides 2 chicks at the same time?
Oh, yeah.
Nothing.
Nothing, huh?
I would relax. I would sit on my ass all day. I would do nothing.
All right, that does it for me this week. I wanted to talk about alienation. It's something that I think a lot of people are feeling, and it's really affecting the way that we relate to ourselves and to each other. But there's hope, and we can get together. So I appreciate you checking out the episode. Check us out on that stuff that's making us sad. Social media. No, it's not capitalism. It's not capitalism. It's social media. Check us out on social media. Sensible Socialist, Sensible Social on Twitter. And if you want to check out our Patreon page and throw a few bucks, that would be super nice. All right. See you next week.